As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The House passes an $886 billion NDAA. So this was on Friday that the House passed its version of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. It passed in a vote of 219 to 210. And the vote fell along partisan lines due to amendments that were added by Republicans relating to social policies in the military. It was kind of strange watching the debate. It was like the culture wars being debated while they're making the NDAA. Because usually, this passes with very strong bipartisan support. But these Republican amendments cover things like abortion, transgender surgery, and diversity initiatives, all within the military. So only 4 Democrats voted in favor of the bill and 4 Republicans voted against it. The 4 Republicans who opposed the NDAA were Reps Thomas Massie from Kentucky, Eli Crane of Arizona, Andy Biggs of Arizona, and Ken Buck of Colorado. The Senate still needs to pass its version of the NDAA, and then the 2 chambers will negotiate the final version that will go to President Biden's desk. So this is usually a pretty long process, and now it might be even a little longer with these Republican amendments in the House version. It's going to set up a fight between the 2 chambers because the Senate is led by Democrats. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats, are not going to want these amendments in there. So again, this is the NDAA. This is the annual military spending bill. And it's $886 billion, which is what President Biden asked for. That was his request. And now, as I've gone over before, if you want to look at the true total of military spending or spending on, national security or the empire, whatever you want to call it, adding other things like the Veteran Affairs Department and the Homeland Security and all sorts of other things, interest on debt, it's the true total is about $1.5 trillion when you factor those things in. All right, the next one here, bipartisan bill would prevent any president from leaving NATO. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and this is a bill that was introduced in the Senate. A group of senators have reintroduced legislation to prevent an American president from withdrawing from the NATO alliance. A version of the bill failed to pass the legislature during the Trump administration. So Senators Tim Kaine, he's a Democrat from Virginia, and Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, they're both members of the Foreign Relations Committee. They introduced this bill, and it had several co-sponsors as well. So this is, you have these senators that, they don't want Congress voting, to go to war or anything. They don't want to worry about that. They want Congress to prevent, the president from leaving this huge entangling military alliance. U.S. intelligence official says that the Ukraine war is a stalemate. So this is interesting. A senior Defense Intelligence Agency official has described the war in Ukraine as a stalemate and said that none of the weapons the U.S. and NATO are providing will help Ukrainian forces break through in their counteroffensive. So this is the DIA Chief of Staff, John Kirchhofer. He said this at a conference this past Thursday. I just saw it on Sunday. But he said, quote, certainly we are at a bit of a stalemate. One of the things that the Russian leadership believes is that they can outlast the support of the West, end quote. He listed some of the weapons that NATO recently began providing, including American cluster bombs and British Storm Shadow missiles. He said, quote, none of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukrainians are looking for that will allow them to break through, end quote. Putin says that Russia can use cluster bombs in a tit-for-tat response. So Putin said Sunday that Russia has a sufficient supply of cluster munitions to use if Ukraine employs the controversial weapons. The U.S. has started shipping cluster bombs to Ukraine, even though the weapons are notorious for killing and maiming civilians, and U.S. cluster munitions have already arrived in Ukraine. I haven't seen any reports yet that they've been in use. So we know, Human Rights Watch has said that both sides have used cluster bombs in the war, and there's other groups and evidence of cluster bomb use on both sides. Although Putin is claiming that Russia hasn't used them, and just from what I've seen, it doesn't. It seems like they have used them, but not at the scale that they might now. That Ukraine is planning to with all this artillery. The U.S., South Korea, and Japan hold joint military exercises after North Korea test fired an ICBM. So this is another one from the Libertarian Institute. This is from Connor Freeman. So Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo held joint naval drills testing missile defense in international waters between Japan and South Korea on Sunday, following Pyongyang's latest intercontinental ballistic missile launch. This is interesting. An envoy from North Korea spoke before the UN Security Council. I think that was on Friday. He defended his government's actions as a response to various military provocations by Washington and its allies. It's pretty rare that the North Korean official would do that, defend these missile tests. So South Korea's Navy portrayed Sunday's drills as an opportunity to improve security cooperation with Japan, as well as the United States in the face of North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. So this is another thing. South Korea and Japan, the U.S. Biden administration has been trying to foster more cooperation there. And, of course, historically, they have a lot of, animosity between them. And they've been kind of trying to get them to cooperate more militarily. And I think it's been successful. They've signed some deals. And so to see them doing joint drills, this is, again, not just a message to North Korea, but also to China. All of this is kind of really about China, the U.S. giving Yoon, the South Korean president, basically whatever he wants. So, it's an excuse for the U.S. to build up on the Korean Peninsula, which is very close to China. And, coming soon, we're not sure exactly when it's going to happen. The U.S. is sending a nuclear-armed submarine to dock in South Korea, which is just a provocation for the sake of provocations. And, who knows what North Korea is going to do in response to that? We don't know. They keep saying that, they're probably going to do, another nuclear weapons test. And basically they're just going to, make that come true if they keep up with these provocations.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
You can apply your libertarian views in many different ways. If you believe in liberty, well, we believe in liberty across the board, but that doesn't mean that you can't, say, talk about one specific issue and focus on what the libertarian take on that issue would be. But that can also lead you into areas where you miss the big picture. And I kind of think that's what's going on here. We've talked a lot about this, where you'd see libertarians, let's say during the height of COVID, whether it was whatever it was, let's say it was during the height of like vaccine mandates during COVID. And you'd have someone like Ron DeSantis in Florida, and he would have a bill that says it's illegal for private businesses to have their own mandates, whether mask mandates or vaccine mandates or something like that. And you'd see a lot of libertarians who are writing pieces attacking him and going, hey, this is not a libertarian solution. And it is authoritarian for you to tell a private business that they can't have whatever rules they want to on their private property. And that is technically correct. It is correct. You from the libertarian perspective, it's tough to argue against that. Like, that's just right. However, at the same time as you have that, you would have libertarians like at the Cato Institute, not Reason, but another kind of similar organization, who would be putting out these pieces like the libertarian case for vaccine mandates. And that was stupid. Okay, the argument there was like something along the lines of, well, it's less of an infringement on liberty than mask mandates, which I don't agree with, but this is the argument. It's less of an infringement on liberty than lockdowns. It's less of an infringement on liberty than mask mandates. So the libertarian who supports maximum liberty and minimal, blah, 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 they can deal with this. And that, okay, that's stupid. That was like a really bad take. It's like, the libertarian case for stabbing. Well, it's better than shooting, like that's just ridiculous. But so we had a lot of that stuff coming out. But that aside, say the libertarian case for why DeSantis's bans on private mandates are wrong is actually a fairly strong libertarian argument. You can argue pretty strongly that on people's private property, they should be able to do what they want to do. However, the reason why something like that would get a bad response from a lot of people, not just libertarians, but a lot of people, is not because technically it's not correct. It's because it's more like, what are you doing here when you're writing this piece, especially if you haven't focused on the bigger issue? Like, if you really care about liberty, are you talking at all about the fact that in all of these other states, there are government enforced mandates in the opposite direction? Now, if you have, and you're railing against Fauci and lockdowns and vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, and then you also go, and by the way, I don't think DeSantis needs to go this far, I think this is wrong, then okay. But there were so many people who would focus all their energy on just the response. And then you sit there and you go, okay, well, now you're almost like weaponizing libertarianism to be this thing where if there's a huge crackdown on liberty, you're going to respond to the reaction to that crackdown and judge them on whether they have a perfect score or not, rather than focusing on the huge crackdown to liberty. Daniel McAdams, who is, of course, Ron Paul's co-host on the Liberty Report, he has this rule. He said the libertarian rule is never do the bidding of the CIA. Like, never. Now, I don't know that it's a complete law of libertarian physics. There are exceptions to it. Like if someone, I don't
needs to be waterboarded. Like just you have to do it.
Yeah, sometimes. Well, I say if someone asks me, do you think Vladimir Putin is a good guy who was justified in invading Ukraine? I will say no. No, I don't. I think he's a bad guy, and I think invading Ukraine was wrong. Now, okay, in a sense, that is kind of what the regime would like me to say. But okay, I don't think you have to take it that far. I don't think I have to say that Kim Jong-un is a good leader or something like that. But the point I believe that he's getting at is that it's like this. It's like if you're a libertarian in 2002, and in 2002, the war drums are beating for the war in Iraq. And, George W. Bush is coming out every day and making his case of how Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and how we actually know that he was in bed with al-Qaeda and he was involved in the planning of 9/11. And he's trying to get these weapons of mass destruction that he really has into the hands of these terrorists that he's really allies with, and that they're going to try to detonate a bomb in, Mississippi or whatever the fucking propaganda at the time was, which, by the way, what I'm saying is not that far off. It was something like that. And let's say you're a libertarian writing at a libertarian publication. And let's say you just constantly are writing pieces about what a brutal dictator Saddam Hussein is and how he violates the natural rights of all of the people who live under his regime and how their regime would be so much better off if Saddam Hussein just wasn't there. Okay, that is technically true. That is accurate from a libertarian perspective. You're not actually wrong. However, for non-autistic libertarians who might actually be capable of zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, you might ask yourself, what the fuck are you doing right now? Like, why is this what you're focusing on? How is it possible that you think this is the most important thing for a libertarian to say right now when you see what's going on? And it would make people think that you are naive at best and a tool of the regime at worst, if that makes sense. And I think that's a big part of what's going on here. I think that's a big part of why people are having such a knee-jerk reaction against this video. I really do not believe that it is that so many people so sincerely believe that Wi-Fi is causing these negative health externalities. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think it's that people see someone fighting against this most corrupt regime, and then they see everyone in the establishment trying to just fucking discard this guy without being willing to take on his arguments, without being willing to sit down mano a mano with him and actually let's see what his response to this would be. Point. And then their response is, so you think Saddam's great? So you must be a Saddam Hussein apologist. And you're like, dude, what the fuck? Are you actually missing the bigger picture here? I don't know what the deal with all these vaccines is. That's how most people feel. We don't know. We're questioning everything these days, but we don't know. But the point is that he's talking about how corrupt this system is. And for some reason, you can figure that out. I'm not going to tell you what it is. But publications like Reason and Cato never seem to have the level of disdain for Anthony Fauci that they have for RFK. Now, why the fuck is that? Because don't sit here and tell me that Anthony Fauci hasn't pushed as much misinformation as you could accuse RFK of pushing at worst. And who had a bigger impact? Like, who really fucking, whose misinformation affected more people's lives? Soft on the alt-right, to this day, there are people who still say this. And it's like, it's not that they're wrong, technically. In the same sense that it's not like you're technically wrong if you said Saddam Hussein is an authoritarian. It's just that I'm going to focus my energy on George W. Bush trying to launch this war in Iraq. Because I think that's more of actually the issue of the thing we should be against.
Right now, things were accelerated a little bit over there in this ongoing war, which was supposed to last a couple months. Yeah. And we suggested at that time, we'll be lucky if we can get out of there in a couple years. And it was the same old stuff as that we went through so often under Bush. But it goes to show that whether you have a Democrat president or a Republican president, and even though they're fighting tooth and nail in the Congress, it's still the wars go on. The wars go on. And even though they're still fighting over that budget, my guess is that the military budget is not going going to have to suffer from any cuts, and this nonsense is going to continue. Well, that's what I see this happening today. The article we picked from Zero Hedge was Russia terminates Black Sea grain deal. Oh, you mean they have economic policies involved in these war policy. Wheat prices spike as extent of Crimea bridge terrorist attack revealed. They attacked the bridge again. So this is deadly, and it's a pretty important bridge. It's between Crimea and Russia, so that's a significant bridge. But it hasn't been blown up, and I think last time they repaired it rather quickly, and they'll probably get this repaired. And I think there's not a whole lot of argument of who did this one. You know, it was probably Ukraine in a way, part of NATO, yes, a part of the United States, because it's probably our weapons and our support for it that did that. But then again, they also would like to work deals on. They had a UN agreement that was about to expire where the Ukrainians could get some grain out, which if you had some common sense, that shouldn't be too difficult to agree to. But anyway, that got canceled, and rightfully so. If your enemy blows up your bridge and you're pretending to help them out by letting the grain go through their territory, that they become annoyed. So I think the big point here is that war so often involved a lot of economic harm and difficulties, and this one especially. Two big items. Gas, blowing up the gas line was a big deal, and now they had made an attempt to keep the grain flowing for humanitarian reasons, for the help of the Ukrainians, and Russia participating in it. But that all sort of got canceled last night, and Russia got out of that deal. So it remains to be seen how soon the Ukrainian wheat will flow. But heck, we could sort of watch the price of a loaf of bread and see if wheat prices go up.
Well, I think the question people would have would be, why would they attack the bridge? Now, they didn't take it out completely. It's obviously going to need some repairs. Who knows how long it'll take? So why would they do it and be so proud about it? Well, the counteroffensive has, to this point at least, failed. Unless something major happens, they've run out of ammunition. I was looking at a report that I think 30% of the Bradley fighting vehicles that were delivered for it are out of commission. I think the Washington Post or New York Times or something reported 20% of all the material sent to them since the counteroffensive was launched a month ago are out. They've lost approximately 20,000 men in arms from this, so it's not going well. They're losing the equipment, they're losing the military might that they need. The only deaths, thankfully, there wasn't a lot of civilian deaths, but it was one family. They were going on vacation, a husband, a wife, and a 14-year-old daughter. Both of the parents were killed in this attack. There's some gruesome video that I do not suggest anyone look at right after the attack was made. But sadly, the girl did survive, but she's in the hospital now. So you have if there are legitimate military targets, of course, but you do have a family that's been destroyed because of that. And here's what the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, here's what they commented on the murder of this family. They said, the number of potential domestic summer tourist destinations for Russians is falling with alarming regularity. And so they're actually making a joke out of the fact that they killed a family on the way to vacation. And you'd say this is a spoof account. No, this is the official page of the Ministry of Defense. I would say at the least, Dr. Paul, that's in bad taste. That's trolling, and this is war. All sides do it, but I found that to be, in particular, bad taste. So we'll keep an eye on what this means and what happens. What will the escalation be? Last time they hit the bridge, the Russians launched the biggest volley of missiles that they had to that point. What will they do now? Will there be a lot of pressure on Putin to react strongly? Because the pressure comes from him not to settle down, but to get even more aggressive. So I think in the next few days it'll be very interesting to see. It's
going to be reflected in the Republican primary races because there are more of the Republicans speaking out and taking a position closer to ours. And at the same time, there's still the control of the money, and it's still the military-industrial complex. And there are disagreement among the many candidates for president. And of course, sometimes you look back and you think about what Biden is saying and compared him to some of the things the Republicans have said. I bet you could get a pretty good list of where they were together on most of this stuff.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up, actually. I don't know if you watched any of that Blaze TV summit over the weekend that Tucker Carlson hosted. I watched some of it, and of course on Twitter it went crazy because he had Mike Pence on. And Tucker being great, he said, we're spending all these billions of dollars in Ukraine, and we're going to send more and more, and you want to send more and more. Yet look at American cities, they're really a disaster. And Pence said, that's not my concern. And it really, whether he misspoke or whatever the case was, the perception was that Mike Pence doesn't care about America, he only cares about war in Ukraine. And Nikki Haley similarly was put on her back heels by Tucker, and Tim Scott was made to look extremely foolish. So it was pretty interesting to watch that. It was pretty well done.
Well, I mean, he signaled incredible weakness, especially after that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And all along the way, the Biden administration has been slow in providing military support. Make no mistake about this. We promised them 33 Abrams tanks in January. I heard again 2 weeks ago in Ukraine, they still don't have them. We've been telling them we'll train their F-16 pilots, but now they're saying maybe January we'll let somebody transfer some jets.
I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President. Have you? I know you're running for president. You are distressed that the Ukrainians don't have enough American tanks. Every city in the United States has become much worse over the past 3 years. Yeah. Drive around. There's not one city that's gotten better in the United States. Okay. And it's visible. Our economy has degraded. The suicide rate has jumped. Public filth and disorder and crime have exponentially increased. Right. And yet, your concern is that the Ukrainians, a country most people can't find on a map, who've received tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars, don't have enough tanks. Right. I think it's a fair question to ask, like, where's the concern for the United States in that?
Well, it's not my concern.
Move on, because this is interesting, and you wrote about it this week too, but it really is worth a mention. It happened on, of course, it was a Friday or Thursday. Put up that next clip. And it caught our attention for sure. Biden order activates 3,000 reservists for Europe deployments. You might say, well, 3,000, that's, big deal, whatever. But they mobilized 3,000 U.S. military reservists, and they're sending them in support of the operation in Ukraine. Now, they're not going to Ukraine that we know of, but they're part of that operation. So I don't know what it says. What do you think?
Well, this is something that when you look at it, you say, well, why are we doing this? Why? My first reaction was that it's not going to help their enlistments. Yeah. And that's they're living in a practical world, getting more grunts to go out there and expose their lives. But that didn't happen so much, and this will actually decrease the enlistment, because I remember so clearly, and I'm sure you do too, about all the family tragedies of the Mideast wars that went on for 10, 15 years, and it was always relying on reservists and the State Guard and all these things that shouldn't be over there. They probably even had the Coast Guard over there, protecting our coast. Yeah. So that to me is not a help for people to enlist, which is good news for us, because people become more attuned to this. But it's the other thing, though. It brings up the bigger subject that we deal with, in the article, and what I've done for years is, should there be a draft? Yeah. We had a big fight in the 70s. The draft was canceled, but then when they were bringing back registration, there was a big argument on the floor on registration, and I always took our position on that. And the position. I always wondered why would you why do you have to register? Because I've heard too many stories that they had all our names and all our dates, and they knew exactly where we were, because they'd come find, you didn't register, for the draft. And back then it was conservatives for registration in the draft. And I had one very, very liberal Democrat come up to me who was against the draft. He said, "You had the greatest argument," because I said, "How come you're against registering your gun, but you want to register your kids?"
Yeah, you're right. I mean, your take is absolutely correct. The military recruiting crisis is getting worse, and this is their military guy. I don't know him. I don't know his work, but it's just to point out that this isn't going any better, and it's almost like a double whammy, Dr. Paul, because you have all the woke stuff that turns people off. Maybe it's a triple or a quadruple whammy. I think that's turning a lot of people off, and we've talked about that. We have the fact that the poverty draft is not as acute as it has been in the past. At least we're living under the illusion that there's still some sort of economic, sense going on. But then you also have now you're going to start calling people up again? You're right, I mean, remember those stories. Some single mother, hey, I signed up to do my 1 weekend a month for some extra milk money or something, and now we're in Iraq for 10 years.
And they like the idea of defending the homeland. We're willing to fight it. We're fighting up our homeland. Yeah. But they want to pick them up and march them overseas. But we recently had sent 20,000. This is another 3,000 that we're sending. But I was a little shocked that we have over 100,000 in Europe.
Wow.
And it'd be sure a blessing if we could just bring them home.